Thank you very much. Well, I'm impressed that we can fill a room to talk about statistics, and I'm flattered to be in the company of some of the other folks you have coming through here. So what I want to talk about is both the promise and the pitfalls of statistics. The whole big data thing is not an illusion. You don't have to be that old to remember the days when if you wanted to buy something, somebody would physically take the tag off the item, and then they would go, if you gave them a credit card, and you know, remember that pleasant sound, the imprint machine. And both of those would be paper records that would go in their respective boxes. Maybe somebody at that location would sort through them, maybe not. But they certainly couldn't be aggregated in the way they are today. And over across town in a different discipline, if you then got a parking ticket, you got arrested, you committed some violent felony, somebody would do an arrest report in triplicate, and they would take the carbon copies off, and those would go in their respective boxes, and they would go in the basement of some building. And again, nobody would necessarily look at who'd committed what offenses, where they were happening, and so on. And all of that, of course, is fast forwarded to the present, where all of that stuff is not only digital, but can be combined with other kinds of data so that we can paint really, really interesting pictures about all the kinds of things that you do. Now, there are a lot of reasons to be concerned both about some of the privacy aspects, but also some of the misuse of the data. And that's why I'm putting statistics up there with some of the other things. Hair removal cream, you know, I wanted to move away from the military analogies. And I thought that's one where it can be handy or go wildly awry. By way of background, which may or may not have come through in the introduction, I'm not a math geek. And part of the motivation for this book was that some of this stuff is too important to be left to just the mathematical disciplines. And in fact, the most insightful thing I think that's been said about the book was from my old employer, The Economist, and the opening of that review said, Charles Wheelan does not love statistics. He loves what you can do with statistics. And I think that's a very accurate assessment, that this is a powerful discipline. I'm a policy guy at heart. I came to statistics in grad school because most of the things I cared about, whether it was crime, education reform, paying teachers' rights, evaluating affirmative action, all these things require data, and data require statistics, right? That's how we make use of the information. So I come at this from a what can it do for me today sensibility, and that's essentially what we're going to talk about. And that, you know, you've got your copy of the book. In the book is a story I want to tell that I think encapsulates everything that I just summarized. You may have seen this because the story was originally reported by the New York Times Magazine. One subtext of the story, which will become apparent as I tell it, is remind yourself if the New York Times Magazine asks to visit me at work and shadow me, you might want to say no. The reason is the New York Times went to watch the data analytics unit at Target. Target, like other retailers, had begun to appreciate that pregnant women develop very important, what they describe as retail relationships, meaning that if they start shopping at your store when they're pregnant, for whatever reason, they are likely to become loyal customers for a long time. So the idea is get pregnant women into your store as often as possible. How do you do that? Well, you send them coupons, you send them other enticements, and so on. How do you do that? Well, you got to figure out who is pregnant. Enter the data analytics unit. Now, they start out, like most businesses, with one key piece of information that people voluntarily offered up, which is they have a birth registry. So just like a bridal registry, if people are going to have a baby shower for you, you can register for gifts at Target. And when you do that, you tell them roughly when you're due, and obviously you're pregnant. I suppose some people have baby showers if they're not pregnant, but they're the outliers. So they have this subset of women who have declared that they're pregnant and how far along they are. The data folks at Target then said, all right, well, let's look at their shopping patterns as they progress through the pregnancy. So they presumably also have a frequent buyer card or credit card data or something else that tells us what they're buying. And they realize that these women start to buy more cotton balls, they switch to unscented lotions, they buy prenatal vitamins. In total, they do 25 different things that become a pregnancy prediction indicator. And then, of course, they do the logical next thing, which is to look at the whole universe of Target shoppers and say, well, who else is doing these 25 things? And if so, they're most likely pregnant. So the question is, how good is the indicator? In that article, if you saw it, there's a story about a guy in Minneapolis, a father. He has a high school daughter. And he calls up the Target in Minnesota or Minneapolis and says, I don't know what you're trying to do, but my daughter is in high school, and why you are sending her coupons for baby wipes and cribs is beyond me. But you should not be planting these ideas. She needs to finish high school. She needs to finish college. This is ridiculous. And being Minneapolis, the manager was extremely nice, and he said, you know, I'm sorry, this will never happen again, apologize. And he was feeling so bad that he actually called back 3 days later and said, I just want to apologize again. It's been eating away at me. At which point the father says, well, now it's my turn to apologize. And the quote in the article is, quote, there have been some things going on here I was not aware of. And in fact, his daughter was pregnant, and Target knew it before he did. Right? So embodied in that story is essentially a lot of what's going on with big data, which is the capacity to evaluate patterns, to make very powerful inferences about those patterns, some uses which may or may not be acceptable, and we'll talk more about those kinds of things, and then just us asking questions about, all right, what's good, what's not good, what's gray about the way society then turns to these tools, because the tools are not going away. So I thought I'd make just a handful of points. All right, suddenly we're frozen here. There we go. All right. Now, I also, as a preface, would say that even though I've written this book, I would be much richer, should be much richer, because I was there at creation with the potential of big data. About 20 years ago, I had a lunch with a college classmate of mine in a Mexican restaurant, and he said, I want to bounce an idea off of you. He said, it's now possible, he laid it out, he said, look, doctors currently see their patients. They may operate, they may see a patient, they dictate their notes into a recorder, they give that recorder to an assistant or secretary, that person spends the whole next day typing up the notes, they then get transcribed. Best case, the doctor gets the notes at least 24 hours after he or she has dictated them. He said, look, it's now possible at the end of the day to make a digital recording of this instead of analog, to send it over fiber optic cable to India, and have somebody in India, because of the time change, work on it, or several people, and you can compare and look for mistakes, type it overnight in the US, and then mail it, send it back the next morning, and you'll have a transcript of what was said at a lower price. And all I can say is I looked at him and asked him how many margaritas he's had. Because this was the craziest idea I had ever heard. He went on to be one of the co-founders of Hotwire. So clearly, you know, he had this germ of an idea. These ideas just kept bouncing off of me. So I'm not one to be at the forefront of this. But that notwithstanding, it's here. And big data is upon us. For reasons that I said, it's not going away. Some of you may or may not be old enough to remember, certainly in grad school in the early days, when not only were data harder to come by, but so was computing time, right? I mean, the point when it was expensive to actually book time on the mainframe, so you had less data to work with, but you also had to be far more parsimonious in the models that you could look at. You couldn't just go into a computer lab and essentially free run whatever models and regressions you wanted in hopes that something might turn up significant. That matters for reasons that we're going to talk about, because the cheaper the computing power, obviously there's greater potential to search and analyze data, but there's also more potential that if you just feed enough models in there, something's going to spit out and it's going to look significant. That is both, like everything else I'm talking about, an opportunity and a danger. As I said earlier, the statistics here haven't changed that much. Mostly what's driving this is the data piece. The statistics are just the tools for making sense of it. So if we want to look at questions like I look at, how is the American middle class doing? We're going to spend a lot of time debating what the middle class is. I could just go, you know, if they were to provide the data to the Census Department and get files on 130 million households in a giant spreadsheet, and I'd have nothing to work with whatsoever. I would be deluged with information. So instead, we're going to simplify in ways that make sense of the data. And as soon as we simplify, we're going to lose information. So people have always asked me, since the book came out, do people lie with statistics? And of course they do. And people lie without statistics. I mean, people lie all the time. There are two rejoinders. One is it's easier to lie without statistics than it is with. I mean, it just encumbers you. But I think, that's just an element of dishonesty. The more relevant piece is statistics have a point of view. And the metaphor I've settled on here is it's a bit like an American courtroom. So if you go into court for any significant case, the prosecution and the defense both have access to all the same raw data. All of the evidence, all of the depositions, all of the interviews, they both see everything. But if you were then to go into court and ask and to observe the presentation made by the defense and the prosecution, they're selectively presenting the information that they had access to. And statistics give us that capacity. So if somebody has a particular point of view, statistics will allow them to put whatever spin they want on it. And that's, I think, something to remember. Is it dishonest? It doesn't have to be. It can be. But of course, if you are an advocate for something, then you're going to use the statistics and pull the particular data that make your case look the strongest. That's just the reality of different parts of society. The other piece, all right, so here I want you to actually do something. So I need you to pull out a coin if anybody still uses real money. And I need you all to do this for it to work. If you can flip your ID if you want, if your face will be heads in the back of it. You all got a copy of the book. Last time I spoke, whoever did a certain thing flipping got a copy of the book, so there was more motivation here. But this will have to be its own reward. So what we're going to do is a little exercise here where you're going to flip coins. If it comes up heads, you stay in. If it comes up tails, you're out. Okay, and we're going to see how this works out. So let's do flip number one. All right, I'm going to do it too here. All right. I'm out already. So if you've got heads, raise your hand. Okay, only the heads stay in this time. I want all the heads to flip again. All right, who got heads? All right. That was a bit. So heads stay in again, flip again. Who are heads? All right, flip again. All right, any heads? All right. One, and we don't know because you couldn't keep it on the desktop, but which is not something I'd anticipated here. All right, we got a heads here. Now, the odds of flipping 5 in a row, I think, are 1 in 32. So what's interesting about that is the common threshold for statistical significance, or at least an acceptable one, is 0.05, which is less, which is a greater threshold than 1 over 32. So typically, when we look at studies, and we find some outcome or some association. So eating broccoli seems to have an association with lower rates of cancer. Unless it's a controlled experiment, we'll talk about that in a minute, really we're just looking at associations that are unlikely to happen by chance. So we'll have one group that didn't eat broccoli, one group that did eat broccoli. The group that ate broccoli had better health outcomes. How often would that just happen by coincidence? And if it's likely to happen by coincidence less than 5 times in 100, we reject that it was just coincidence and we implicitly accept the notion that something else is going on here. Now, if you do enough of those studies and you accept enough of enough situations where your 0.05 is your threshold for cutoff, let's put a number on it. If you do 100 of those studies, then 5 times out of 100, you're going to get coincidence rather than something else going on. Now, the coin flipping exercise I did, because what I usually do with my undergrads is I follow up and say, boy, you are a really good coin flipper. Right? What is it? Right? If we didn't see everything else that happened, and all we did is say, boy, here's somebody who flipped 5 heads in a row. The odds of doing that are less than 5 in 100, so clearly she's a really talented coin flipper. Right? What is it? The elbow? Is it, start with the hip? Is it you always want to use a nickel because of the weight of Jefferson on the head? No, it's just chance. And so I think one point I wanted you to take into the rest of the talk is that the marriage of lots of data and cheap computing power means everybody can run a study. And everybody running a study is a bit like a room full of people flipping a coin. So to the extent that you can't do the gold standard, which is controlled experiments, you want to be very cognizant of the fact that sometimes these things are just, actually more than sometimes, as we'll talk about in a minute, sometimes these things are not causal. Sometimes these things are not true associations. Sometimes these things are just products of chance. Now, that said, let's go the other direction. My first big point is the fact that we have access to data can and should make our lives better. And I'm going to give you, two competing examples here. One is, how many of you have heard of the FARS, F-A-R-S? Here in DC, you might have actually heard of it. Tell me what FARS is.
Fatality Analysis Reporting System.
All right, and who does it?
The U.S. Department of
Department of Transportation. It's also the Iranian news agency, but that's not the answer I was looking for. Fatality Analysis Reporting System. Every time somebody in this country dies in a motor vehicle accident, by federal law, a huge complement of data are collected. What time of day, who was driving, blood alcohol level of the driver, the passenger, everybody else involved in the accident, kind of tires, road conditions, etc. Why is that important? Because that explains many of the advances that we have made in motor vehicle safety. If you think about the whole Ford Explorer debacle, which in the grand scheme of things didn't cause that many fatalities, right, in the hundreds, and they were spread out across the United States. How did we observe this pattern between Ford Explorers and a certain kind of tire? Well, it's because we were able to aggregate data on fatalities from all over the nation and see a pattern that would not have emerged if all of those accidents had been taking place in different jurisdictions, different states. You might see one, you might see two, you're certainly not going to see a pattern. So it makes a difference, and it's also true about collapsible steering wheels, people getting ejected from the vehicles. Most of what we know about making cars and light trucks and trucks safer comes from what we know, a lot of what we know about how people die in automobile accidents. All right, guns. When people are killed in domestic violence, how often is a gun involved? Anybody know? If a gun is involved, how often was it purchased within a certain, say, a week of the incident? When people commit suicide, how often is the gun purchased within a short window, say 3 to 5 days of the incident? I had a group of students who did the presentation, and the answer to all those questions is we don't know. And the reason we don't know is there is no comparable data collection system, and in fact, it has been, the proposal to do so has been thwarted. One of the stories I wrote about for The Economist was a system where they did that on a trial basis in Wisconsin. It was a collaboration of the Harvard School of Public Health, one of the Wisconsin medical schools, the Joyce Foundation, and they systematically asked questions like auto fatalities around gun fatalities, including accidents, right? So one of the things they discovered in Wisconsin is, and if you're not a gun person, you wouldn't know this, that a high proportion of accidents among children occur. Anyone want to guess? Why do you think, what is the, I can't say it's the single largest, but it contributes to a high proportion of children killing other children with guns?
Hunting.
No, hunting actually was not. Right? So how, you see the movies and somebody's got a fancy 9mm pistol, they pull the clip out, right? They're always slamming the clip in, clip out, right? When you take the clip out, how many bullets are left in the gun? One. How many 9-year-olds know that? Right? So a high proportion of gun accidents among children occur because they take the clip out where there is no clip in it, and they logically assume that there is not a bullet left in the gun. And in fact, there's one, and one is all it takes for a tragedy. Right? So these are the kinds of things, and again, what's interesting about that is it's kind of separate from this larger political debate because, a load indicator is probably, nothing is easy in the gun debate, but that's probably the least contentious kind of thing that would come out in the political arena. But there has never been the political will or the money to take that Wisconsin experiment larger. And yet there are tons of things that could be answered. And in fact, we have most of the data around guns. So the coroner has to report cause of death. ATF will often gather data on the kind of gun involved in a homicide and so on, but it's never consolidated in the way that it is for motor vehicles. And I would argue that there's a potential there both to do an end run around some of the political dead ends, but also just to prevent a lot of tragedies, accidents, suicides, and so on. All right. As I've just explained, it's very controversial and expensive. All right. So point number 2 that I want you to kind of take away is precision and accuracy are not synonymous. Big data and statistics allow us to be precise. You hit the return key and you get an at 0.20175, and that is a very impressive sounding number. That's precise. Accuracy is whether that number has any relation to the underlying reality. Right? So if I walk out on the main street and I say, where is the nearest gas station? And you point and say, well, you know, I've got a little GPS device here. It is 1.35 miles that direction. And it turns out your GPS device is loaded for Washington State, and the nearest gas station is actually that direction. A precise answer that's not accurate. Now here's my sad golf story. My beloved wife gave me a rangefinder for Christmas. You know, it's one of those things where you look through it. The laser measures the exact distance to the hole, so you no longer have to improvise with the white stakes and everything else. And so I'm now 132.1, and clearly my golf game should take off like this. And in fact, it gets steadily worse. And it reaches, I'm firing into the woods. It reaches a low point when on the Hanover course, the police department is right off the 10th hole, and all the police officers park their personal vehicles in a lot adjacent to the fairway, and I started pelting it into that lot, which was bad on many levels. So I go and I actually read the directions, and it turns out for 4 months this thing has been set to meters, not yards. So that is the personal version of a more serious example, which is the value at risk models. And it's actually, when I was waiting for everyone to come in, I see the poster over there that says lessons from past events. And lessons from past events is another one of those things that cuts both ways. So how many of you have heard of the value at risk models? All right, this is what essentially took down Wall Street. It started, I think, with J.P. Morgan, but the rest of the street eventually adopted them. And the idea was they need to manage risk. Everybody knows that. The models were built such that they could quantify the risk associated with each open position. So if you were all traders in the firm, we could look at your portfolio, we could construct a range of probable outcomes around that portfolio. So the probability that it loses 25% of its value over a certain time frame, so over the next 24 hours, the next week, is such and such, right? And then what we would say is 99 times out of 100, the maximum loss for your portfolio over the next 24 hours is X. Let's say $11.1 million. And then we can do that with each one of your portfolios, and we can even do offsetting things. So if you're long yen and you're short yen, then whatever happens to the yen, those are going to be offsetting risk. And the beauty of it and the danger is that we could then roll up the risk of the entire firm and say 99 times out of 100, the maximum loss for the firm over the next 24 hours is $171 million, right? Now that's dangerous on two levels. One is 99 times out of 100, right, is we don't need many more coin flippers to know that every once in a while that 100th thing is going to hit, and it's tail risk, right? And when you're talking about the financial markets, tail risk is not insignificant, and it's extremely contagious. But the second is the models are based on what? Past data, right? So embedded in those models, in the very worst of them, was a probability that real estate prices would fall of 0, right? 0. So needless, and then you go around and you start to act like I did with my rangefinder, which is, well, we know our exposure is $211 million, $327,011, right? And in fact, we're totally untethered from what our real risk is. And the danger, and this is another metaphor I hope will stick with you, is that driving with a broken speedometer is worse than driving with no speedometer at all. And the reason is if you have no speedometer, what do? You just look out the window. You notice the speed of traffic, right? You have a sense of whether you're driving too fast for conditions. You can manage it just fine. What do you do if you have a broken speedometer? You stare at it and you're like, well, I'm only going 55. Everyone else, I'm surprised everyone else is going so slow, right? Well, you're going 111. That's why, right? And in fact, it's too bad it was after the book came out. There was a woman who had a broken GPS device. And she must have had other issues, but she had a broken GPS device in Europe, and she drove 900 miles out of her way. She slept by the side of the road at one point. But not to that extreme, but we've all been in situations, certainly with GPS, where if you get mired in the kind of the map there and you lose sight of the other signposts, then you could end up in a worse place. All right, so let's talk a little bit about predictive analysis, which is a lot of what's going on is we're looking for patterns that can allow us to make inferences that are valuable, as in the target case, about what people are likely to do, likely not to do, who are going to be our customers, who are the dangerous people, and so on. Netflix has done this extremely well, as does iTunes and everybody else. So every time Netflix pops up and says, we think you'll like this movie, it's just predictive analysis. And they, in fact, the rough way they do it is just correlation, which is to say, all right, if all of you happen to like really geeky documentaries and you give them, and every time you rate the movie, you're giving them raw data, and all of you seem to rate those movies exactly as those folks do, or very close to it, then if there's a movie that comes up that you give 5 stars and you haven't seen, then it stands to reason you're going to like that movie. So one of the fun things about the book is I took one of the recommendations that it gave me at the beginning of the chapter, watched the movie while I was writing the chapter, and then reported how I liked it at the end. And it was an excellent prediction. Now, Netflix went one step further, and they said, we're going to pay any group from around the world, some of you may have actually been interested in the competition, $1 million if you can improve on our existing predictive algorithm by at least 10%. And the way they measured whether you improved by 10% or not was also clever, which is they gave folks data stripped of identities on a huge number of Netflix subscribers. They withheld data on another group of Netflix subscribers. And they said, you play around with this, and then when you're done, we will test how your model predicts what these folks have, who have already rated a movie are going to say about a particular movie. So we have a great mechanism. And if your predictions for the number of stars they're likely to give these movies is 10% better than what we're doing now, then you get the $1 million. Somebody did it. And the algorithm includes things like differential weighting when you've seen a movie recently versus in the far past, so your taste might be changing. They also, Netflix has now broken it out into different categories. Right? So when they look at my movie rental patterns and they see that I'm obsessed with Adam Sandler and independent documentaries about Iran, they're thinking this guy just needs to be hospitalized. Right? In fact, I've got a 10-year-old in the house. Right? So their algorithm breaks those two movies out and realizes that I don't want something with Adam Sandler and Iran. Right? They're two separate classes of movies. But it's a very powerful tool. Now, in the law enforcement arena, one of the examples that is in the book is the police department of San Jose, who claim, and this is part of a broader trend of using data for police analysis, which is very powerful, right? So CompStat and other things of that nature allow us to deploy resources more efficiently. So if we can see that there are a spur of robberies in a certain place at a certain time, or that most crimes are committed in a certain time of day, or that the most violent parts of Chicago are certain gang territories, then we can intervene. That is, in theory, a very good thing. Now, San Jose, as I started to say, is the first department that I know of that claims to have stopped a crime before it happened. Right? Anybody know how they claim to have done that? Anybody? All right, so what they did is they saw a pattern of break-ins in a parking garage, and they, a very consistent, powerful pattern. So they started putting more law enforcement around the parking garage at the time when the break-ins were happening, and then they found 2 women loitering near cars. They asked them questions, and it turns out that both women were wanted on previous warrants, which they'd already committed other crimes, so they could arrest them. But what they said is they were going to break into the cars, and we stopped them before they did it. It was only the previous crimes that allowed them to actually do it. All right. Well, that takes us to what? Anyone know what this movie is? Right. And what was the premise of Minority Report? We're going to predictive crime, right? We're going to stop crime before it happens. Well, take everything that I just described, which in the right hands is extremely powerful, and you are only like a quarter tick from racial profiling, from a whole bunch of other things that get very uncomfortable very fast, right? I have no doubt that we can find a pattern for people bringing drugs into the country from the Mexican border, probably time of day, type of vehicle, age of the person doing it, what they look like, and so on. But that's a real problem if you happen to own a red truck and commute to work and you're a certain age profile, right? Because you're just going to be harassed over and over again. So I think one of the lingering questions here is, this is fine for movies, and it's even fine for law enforcement up to a point, but at what point and using what processes are we going to figure out where we want to use this predictive analysis and where we don't? And I think we're just at the very cusp of some of those kinds of decisions. All right. The good news is if you're doing good research, big samples make everything easier. That's the beauty of data. The bad news is big samples just make your mistakes look less egregious, right? So if you're doing a telephone poll, a really, really good telephone poll, and all you can afford to call is 400 American households, but you got a great sample of America for whatever reason, your margin of error on that poll is going to be very big, right? So you're not going to have a whole lot of credibility. You know, it's going to be a gap that's going to make it very hard to really make meaningful inferences about who's going to win the election. If, on the other hand, you do random dialing of 100,000 households, just because your N gets really big, your margin of error on that poll is going to be very, very small, and the answer you can provide is going to look very, very good from a precision standpoint. Now, what actually, tell me, so let's suppose we have this fancy auto dialer and it calls 100,000 households. What's wrong with your sample?
People have to pick up the phone.
People have to pick up the phone, right? So if you're looking not at political stuff, if you're looking at kind of unemployment data, what you're going to find is, oh my goodness, most of America is unemployed and lonely. Right? And old, right? I mean, wow, who knew? Right? Yeah, well, who else is answering the phone at noon, right? So it turns out that polling is particularly prone to these kinds of mistakes. So the reason that Gallup said nice things about the book is that the editor-in-chief of Gallup came to Dartmouth and gave a talk to my class, and one of the things he said is polling is one of the few disciplines that's actually getting harder because of technological changes. Yes, it is easier to do auto dial, but competing against that is caller ID, cell phones. So among the many problems caused by cell phones are the fact that you now have more than one phone attached to your name. So in the days when everybody had one landline, we couldn't call you twice. But now with cell phones, we could call you twice. If you got a work phone, we could call you. You're now in the sample 3 times. So somehow you have to correct for the fact that you've got landlines and cell phones. In the case of students, they have no landline at all, so only cell phones. The other thing is you could correct if you were trying to get a representative sample in the United States. The best way to do it with polling in the old days was to get a representative sample of area codes, because every area code had a geographic distribution. You knew what the population of that area code was and so on. Well, now, if my students give me a phone number, the area codes are 312-609-773, and they all live in Hanover, New Hampshire. So the area code is now useless as an indicator of whether you're getting an accurate sample of the country. So we've entered a terrain where technology on this front actually makes the sampling harder than it used to be. One of the ironies is that polling began, if you go way back, with visiting people in their homes. And now what Frank Newport from Gallup said is they're actually experimenting with going back to the model, the old-fashioned model, where they're actually making physical visits, because then they have some sense of who they're getting, how old you are, where you're actually living, and so on. All right. Here's a different, one of the things I want people to be cognizant of is this huge quantity of data makes everybody a potential scientist. And there are as you delve into the research, there's so many ways that even very good researchers can be tripped up. I want people to be aware of just the potential biases. The most interesting one I stumbled across while I was working on the book was something I'd never heard of before. It was called recall bias. And it was a public health study done by some very sophisticated folks on breast cancer and diet. And there was a group of women who had developed breast cancer and a group of women who had not. They were subsequently asked prospectively, retrospectively, so looking back, what their diet had been. So, tell me about what you've been eating for the last 5 or 7 years. And it turned out that the women who had developed breast cancer had, in fact, had less healthy diets. I think it was higher in fat and some other things like that. All right. That's not the punchline of the study. Does anybody know what actually was going on here? I'll give you a clue in that it was not actually a study of breast cancer and diet. The twist was that the researchers had information already on the women's diets because these women had been part of another study and had been asked many years earlier about what they were eating. What the researchers looked at is the comparison of what women reported eating in real time. So like this afternoon, what did you have for lunch today? With their retrospective memories of what they said they had been eating. And what they found was that there was, in fact, no difference in diets when reported in real time. Instead, when women were asked to look back, their theory is the women who developed breast cancer were looking for a causal agent. And they imputed causality to their own. Boy, I must have, if only I'd eaten better. And their recollections of what they ate were noticeably different than the control group when compared against the real-time data for what they're eating. So, I mean, that's a very obscure kind of bias. In the same public health family is the whole notion of healthy user bias. Right? So if I tell you that people who floss their teeth 6 or more times a day are less likely to develop heart disease, do you think the findings are robust. Do you think we should invest in a huge flossing campaign? Right? No, because first, there is actually a bacterial connection, so it's not crazy. But 6 times a day is a bit much. No, people who floss 6 times a day are not normal, right? So they're mountain biking to work and doing push-ups during meetings and taking multivitamins, right? So it's all this other stuff that's associated with the flossing, and that's called the healthy user bias. That even people who take their medicine are different than people who don't take their medicine. So, one of the many reasons you give people placebos is that when you look at research, the people who continue taking their placebo turn out to be healthier than the people who stop taking their placebo. Why? Not because the placebo is a sugar pill, because people who keep taking their medicine are different than people who stop taking their medicine. Right? So there is a certain caution around all of these data. Coincidences happen all the time. That was our coin flipping example. One of the takeaways here, so I can't pronounce the name, the Greek name, maybe some of you can, but there's a study in one of the major medical journals that reviewed, I think it was something on the order of 1,000 journal articles, also in prominent medical journals, so Journal of the American Medical Association, New England Journal, and so on. And what he found, and these were all studies that had been cited a minimum number of times. It was a huge number, I want to say 500 or 1,000 times. So very prominent studies, and roughly a third of them were subsequently refuted by other work. And these weren't necessarily new scientific discoveries. His theory is that there were assorted biases, including a publication bias, which is there's a certain excitement to publish anything that suggests we have progress against heart disease, cancer, and so on. And that's certainly more likely to get published than, boy, we looked at broccoli and it doesn't make you healthier. Right? That's not a journal article or a newspaper article that people get excited about. So the tendency to find studies, if I were to pitch a story to the Washington Post saying that, what, flipping a coin is just a product of choice, that's not as interesting as, boy, I've got a coin flipper and she is really good. Right? I mean, that's a sexy story. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but not enough, pointed out the connection that every time Tiger Woods has played good golf, the Dow Jones has been on a tear. Right? If you think that's causal, good luck. All right. Then this is just think about this when you're trying to go to sleep tonight. Right? If his study is in fact correct, then there's a good chance that his research will be rescinded. Yeah, just like, don't think about it too hard or your head will blow up. All right. In that vein, certainly for people like me in the policy realm, but also in public health and other areas, the big question that we come back to over and over again is, have we identified a causal relationship where doing A brings about change B, or have we merely identified some relationship like flossing and better health that is simply suggestive of something else that's going on? Now, the first point is sometimes it doesn't matter. So facial tattoos. I don't think anyone's got a facial tattoo here. I'd be surprised if you did. Right? If you are an HR manager and you come to realize that people with facial tattoos don't turn out to be very good employees, you don't care if that is causal. Right? It's almost certainly not. Right? If we took this half the room and gave you tattoos, little teardrops, you would not become worse workers. And in fact, this is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but there is actually a finding from a Canadian tire retailer that people who buy Skull and Bones decals for their cars are worse credit risks when you control for income. There's a shocker, right? But what they were trying to do is figure out who were going to be deadbeats, right? Again, controlling for credit score and income. So they've already got the rough cuts. Beyond that, there's still enormous variation who pays and who doesn't. So they wanted to know, and they have data on what you buy, right? So Skull and Crossbones, not so good. The best indicator of your credit worthiness, again, controlling for those other things, is buying bird seed. Right? Because, and their theory is that you've got people who feed the birds are inherently altruistic and feel very bad about defaulting on their credit, right? So, roof shovels is another one. Like there's a big long, it was Canada, so there's a big long thing that you can shovel off your roof, which is the ultimate act of foresight and prevention, right? Anybody who's shoveling their roof is way out in front of problems, right? So bird seed, yes. Roof shovels, yes. Skull and Crossbones, no. It's all right. So facial tattoos doesn't matter if it screens for something else. That can actually be a problem, because at that point what we're talking about is some form of discrimination. But it's a very short and easy way to say no. If I'm a policy person and I say, boy, there are a whole bunch of people getting out of jail who aren't doing well in the labor market, maybe if we stop them from getting tattoos, they'll do better. Probably not the case, because whatever would have led them to get the tattoo in the first place is probably what's going on. So sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't. Where I come from, most of the time, it does. So obesity is one where we're wrestling with. I don't know if you do any work in that realm. It is, I think it has already eclipsed smoking as one of the most expensive public health problems in terms of preventable illness and death. Smoking coming down in part because we've been so aggressive in getting rid of it. Obesity going up and all the attendant costs. So there were two recent studies. One is obesity is much more common in places that have billboards advertising fast food. Right? Now, which direction does the causality go on that? The answer is we don't really know, right? Because there may be people who really like fast food. That's where I would put my billboards, right? On the other hand, the billboards are there to change behavior. It actually could go both directions, right? Another one is food desert. So Michelle Obama was talking about this for a while, and I applaud her for her effort in the overall issue. Food deserts are places where there's a shortage of supermarkets. And indeed there is, particularly in urban areas, there is indeed a very strong correlation between a shortage of supermarkets and obesity. And one theory is that if there's not a supermarket where you can get fresh produce, then you go to the 7-Eleven or someplace else and with very little fresh food, so you buy stuff that's high in sodium and fat and those kinds of things. But another theory is if you've got some kind of underlying problem with obesity, that's not the place where supermarkets are likely to go. So the causality on this one, and it matters a lot, of course, when you think about a policy intervention. Do you want to be preventing billboards for fast food? Do you want to be subsidizing supermarkets? There's actually a lot of talk in the policy realm about using nonprofit co-ops and other things to make fresh food more accessible. I don't know at this point, reading the research, whether that's a causal relationship or not. So, I mean, one thing that you might want to take away, and this is certainly one thing we've learned in the policy realm, is that some of the best researchers are those who find very clever ways to overcome this causality question. So Esther Duflo just won the Card Medal in economics, which is given to the best economists under 40. For a long time, it was more prestigious than the Nobel because it was only given every 2 years. Now it's given yearly. But there's a high correlation between getting the Card Medal and going on to get a Nobel. And what she's done is to randomize experiments around economic development in the developing world. So one example of her study is in India, there's a big problem with one-teacher schools because the teachers don't show up. Teachers don't show up, not much is going to happen. It's very hard to monitor that. So one of the proposed interventions, and this is beautiful in its simplicity, was to give the kids a camera with an indelible date stamp. And every day you took a picture of you with your teacher. And if the teacher had a picture at the end of the month with her students X number of days, they got a bonus. Right? So they would pay, you had a way of measuring attendance, and you had a way of compensating them to provide an incentive. And then she randomized. She gave the cameras to one randomly picked set of schools. She didn't do anything to the other set of schools, and they compared both attendance rates for teachers and better outcomes for students. And in fact, the students did better, not surprisingly, when teachers showed up. And teachers showed up, not surprisingly, more often when there was an incentive to do so. It's a very clever experiment. There's nothing about the statistics that are rocket scientists. It's all about thinking through the process. So, one other example is discontinuity analysis. This is a colleague of mine from my PhD program was looking at whether mandatory summer school in the Chicago public schools increases performance. Actually, let me give you a different example because this is probably closer to your hearts if you have kids who are trying to get into highly selective schools. You want to know whether magnet schools in Chicago had any impact. So magnet schools in Chicago and some other cities are the ones that are hard to get into. You have to test to get in. They're free. They're public schools, but only those folks with the highest test scores and grades get in. And then, of course, all kinds of attention is lavished on them. Are they better for students than where they would have gone? And that's a hard question to answer because only talented students get in. So you can't just compare them to the students who go to the regular high school because the regular high school, those kids weren't smart enough to get into the magnet school. So it's actually a difficult, and you don't want to randomize, right? You go to the magnet school, you don't. You go to Harvard, you don't, right? Parents would have trouble with that. Instead, all he did was look at the cutoff. There's a rigid cutoff. It's not like college where there are essays and things. It's a formula based on attendance, grades, and test scores. And they draw a line at 89.17. And all he did was compare the kids who got 89.17 and got in to the kids who got 89.16 and did not. Right? They were essentially identical. And they've more or less been randomized between the two schools. And it turns out there was no appreciable difference in the life outcomes of the students who fell just above and just below that cutoff. And by the way, Alan Kruger, who's now chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, did a similar study around getting into highly selective schools, where he took a large group of students who had gotten into a highly selective school and had applied somewhere else. Right? So in his sample, everybody had gotten into a very good school. Some went to what he described as the highly selective schools, some did not. And again, there was no discernible difference in income, which was their only measure, many years later, except for minority students where going to a highly selective school did have a significant impact on later income. All right, let me finish with one other different kind of danger. Anyone know who that woman is, proudly displaying her medal? If you go online, you can see her photo now. Was taken by the Atlanta Police Department. It's a mugshot. She doesn't look nearly as happy. All right, who is she?
The school's chancellor for Atlanta.
And what's the mugshot about?
Test scores.
Massive cheating scandal. Massive cheating. The good news is, for statistics, the cheating scandal was discovered because of statistics. There are now companies that do test diagnostics, and they can't prove, but they can find circumstantial evidence of cheating on multiple choice tests. What would you look for? What are your clues? You're just running answer sheets through a bunch of Scantron machines.
It's the same error in the same location.
Yes, so right. If you start to see, now that's it's a good one. It's not a great one because if you got a bad teacher and she's teaching something wrong, everybody's going to get everything wrong. But you're definitely barking up the right tree. You start to look for groups of students who systematically get harder questions right and easy questions wrong because it suggests the answers have been doctored afterwards. And then the biggest one is you look for erasures where there's a disproportionate number of answers going from wrong to right, because that suggests somebody has just taken the answer sheets, erased, and put in the right answers. Again, you can't prove anything. But in the case of Atlanta, the probability of having so many wrong to right erasures was equated to the same probability as having everybody show up for whatever their sports stadium is for a game, 50,000 people, all of whom by chance happen to be over 7 feet tall. Right? It can happen. It's not likely, right? So they said, we might want to ask questions. What they found when they asked questions was there were pizza parties on the weekend where teachers would bring their answer sheets and socialize, listen to music, have pizza as they systematically erased and drew in. And that's what led to, so the statistics led to the investigation, which led to the real smoking gun, which led to her arrest. All right, so where that takes us, and this is the last point I'll make, is a conflict between two things that are always going to be with us. The first is the management aphorism that you've almost certainly heard. You can't manage what you can't measure, right? So we want to know who's doing a good job, and we want to compensate those folks, just like the Indian teacher example I just used. And then another one, this is not in the book. The concept is in the book, but it's not called Campbell's Law, because it was only once I started talking about the book that someone mentioned that's what it's called. But the more important a statistic is for decision making, the more prone it is to manipulation and abuse. as in the case of Atlanta cheating. I'll finish with just a couple other examples. One is the New York cardiologist. So the state of New York decided it would be a good idea, and this is eminently defensible, to just promulgate information on the mortality rate for cardiologists. Right? So what proportion of their patients die. Wouldn't do anything about it. There were no incentives attached. They were just going to make these data public. What happened?
The rate started going up as they started paying more attention to their patients.
Well, all right, so one theory is, yeah, boy, I'm not going to kill anybody today. I hate when it's, yeah, it's possible, but my supposition is that most of them were not trying to kill people, you know. No, they were, there was a follow-up study. Most of them, like 70%, said that they were aware of the figures and they changed their behavior by not accepting the sickest patients, right? The control. So yes, you can control by not trying to kill somebody, but realistically, your biggest lever of control is the patients that you choose to operate on. So the irony here, with a relatively benign form of information/incentive, is that it made it harder for the people who most needed a cardiologist to actually get one. The education parallel comes from the Air Force Academy. One of the great things for social scientists about all of the academies is the students are randomly assigned to classes, so there's no selection effect, and every section in the curriculum has the same syllabus and same tests. So over time, you get a pretty good sense of who the best professors are, right? Because they're getting a random selection of students over and over again, same tests, same materials. So somebody looked at these data and they said, all right, well, who are the best professors at the Air Force Academy? And what they found was that the best course assessments and the best final exam scores in the intro courses were for professors who were relatively young and new and did not have credentials from fancy universities, relatively uncredentialed. And the folks whose scores were less good and evaluations were less good were like the old crusty folks with Harvard and Yale degrees. So, all right, well, that's meaningful, except that it was exactly wrong. Well, they stuck around and did a little more analysis, and what they found was when you look at grades in the advanced courses, it entirely flips. And the students who do best in the follow-on courses are the ones who had the most credentialed professors with the most experience. And the students with the youngest professors did worse. Why? Their theory is that the young professors were most likely to teach to the test, right, in the introductory course, which is also going to get you positive student reviews, right? So I'm going to teach you this. The older folks are like, well, whatever's on the test, you know, suffer through it. Here's what you need to know if you're going to be an engineer, right? They probably didn't care. They probably had tenure, so they didn't really care how you did on the exam. They didn't really care whether you liked them. All right, they just, you know, so, but the dangerous part is if you had made personnel decisions based on only the first finding, not only would it have been inaccurate, it would have been the exact opposite of what you would want to do in terms of promoting the most effective teachers. All right, I will stop there. I've left a little time for questions, but I'll also stick around for anybody who has time. Thank you very much, most important. Good luck with your work. And anybody who can stay, I'd be happy to take questions. Yeah. Thank you.